Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next of these winter, no, this is not the winter worship workshops, but the latest in these Curnow Centre workshops. We're not talking about worship, not in quite the same way anymore, and sitting with me is not Charles Sherlock, but Bishop Andrew Curnow. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleased to see everybody on the screen and look forward to this afternoon.
Those who haven't cottoned or don't know Bishop Andrew personally, Bishop Andrew was the former Bishop of the Diocese of Bendigo, and as you might have picked from his surname, Curnow has a strong connection with the Curnow Centre as well. It was named after Bishop Andrew and his wife Jan, who have given much of their life to rural ministry, and particularly to training and raising up lay people and clergy to serve in rural settings and across the country. And it was our delight to name the Curnow Centre after you, Bishop Andrew.
Thank you.
And as well, then, as we think about the topic of stewardship, you were the first name that came to mind. I know you've thought a lot about finances and stewardship over the years.
Particularly in a rural context. So pleased to be here and share with you.
Well, thank you very much. We're very honoured to have you along. Friends, we'll follow a similar format to the other workshops for those who join them. In a moment, we'll hand over to Bishop Andrew, who will share with us. I guess we've got some of the principles of stewardship and then a number of practical topics to be thinking through about stewardship in a church setting. There'll be opportunities for us to stop and pause and ask questions and have a discussion as we're going through. So again, for those who've just joined us, initially just pop those in the chat and we'll read them out, engage with them, and we'll see then what time we have left at the end. I'm just going to pray quickly and commit this time to God and then hand over to Bishop Andrew. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather from all over the country and to pause for a moment from our regular activities to think about this very important topic of stewardship. We thank you for all that you've entrusted to our care, including our time, and pray that you'll help us to use it wisely. We thank you for Bishop Andrew and his leadership in this area, and pray you'll bless him as he shares with us now. We give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, thank you, Archdeacon George, and I believe that the slides are going to come up during my talking, and everybody will have an opportunity to look at the material. Well, it's helpful to begin that I've been ordained for 50 years, and in that time stewardship, or more the way in which it's practiced, has changed considerably, like everything. But the term stewardship still in the church can produce a wide range of reactions, and certainly in many rural congregations, it's a concept in terms of regular weekly giving that's not always easy to sell, particularly if people are from farming communities where they often are dependent upon annual incomes or an annual large placement of funds rather than a regular weekly income. But look, we'll be talking about those sorts of practical issues as we go along. So let's start with what I'm calling a biblical worldview of stewardship, which is trying to draw together all the different strands of stewardship as it might defined. And I've used the phrase or the sentence, utilising and managing all the resource God provides for his glory and the betterment of God's creation. So when it comes to stewardship, we really are talking about everything in terms of our sphere of living and moving. And the central essence of the biblical view is managing everything that God brings into our lives But stewardship, if we come down to a more technical view, obviously comes from the Greek, two words, oike and oikonomos, and those two words are what we in English encompass in the word stewardship. But the word oikes, which is the foundation behind the Greek word, means household or estate, and how you manage that estate or household. And all of us know in our daily lives we have to manage so many things about our households, be it from giving to paying an encyclopedic amount of bills. Then we have the oikonomos, which is drawing it out a bit more in terms of our role in managing that is to be a steward. And certainly in Scripture, there are references to include stewards of government, money, treasury, administration, and I've missed one out here actually, even the environment, I would say in today's terms and understanding. So that gives you a background. Well, let's now just explore a bit more of where that's going to lead us to. In terms of the church, the particular meaning or way in which we've used the word stewardship has been in relation to both mission and the resources God has given us. And in the wider world, there's a strong link, increasingly, between stewardship and caring for the environment, or even in the concept of well-being, which is being used a lot today. But you could say that the whole basis of stewardship is encapsulated in just that one line from Psalm 24, which says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Mm. In many churches, though, the concept or the way in which we talk about stewardship, it's largely reduced to talking about giving and finances. And many churches I think of all persuasions, leave the issue of stewardship often to just the annual meeting when parishes or congregations get an opportunity to look at the financial performance of the parish. And then there might be some discussion about it. I'm glad to know or hear and experience, as in my own parish of Castlemaine at the present time, there is still initiatives to have an actual review of stewardship, which involves not only our giving, but what is traditionally referred to as time, talents, and money. So, George.
Opportunity for us to just pause there, Bishop Andrew, and people have particular questions to pop them in the chat while they're potentially coming through. Just reflecting on what you said of the different ways that stewardship is received in the church. And I was reflecting on my previous parish in Echuca where I remember quite clearly, they didn't just have the names of the previous incumbents listed, you might recall. Remember, they've got the photographs. All
yes, that's right, yes.
How they have those very first photographs.
The Holy Wall.
The Holy Wall, yes. And some of those early ones looked more like bushrangers than rectors. But I remember one who was almost glaring in the photo, and I can't blank on whether it was Bailey now or one of the others. And while cleaning up the archives, I found where that photo came from, and it was an A4 stewardship booklet, which I think they distribute around town, and he was fully robed, pointing his finger at the person, and it just had the words Christchurch needs you, a bit like the old Uncle Sam. Mm. And I remember reflecting, I wonder how you'd felt if that was the first time you saw him on this big brochure, kind of almost demanding.
Yeah, well, I think that's how, as you say, times have changed. Times have changed significantly. A bit like the Uncle Sam poster, there was this famous poster from England in World War I at the head of the English army, who was General Lord Kitchener. And he had this wonderful image that was on posters all over the United Kingdom of him glaring at you and saying, enlist now. Yeah. And look, I think there's been an element in the way in which the church has approached stewardship over the decades, and particularly through the 20th century, where they've tended to take a somewhat similar approach. Mm-hmm. enlist or contribute or and this sort of heavy pointedness about it. We've moved on, but yes, the slides will be available, folks, and you'll be able to see all of this.
And as well, friends, we are recording this workshop and we'll pop that up on our Diocese and YouTube channel and share the links afterwards. So if you want to go back and rewatch or think about these or share it with others, there'll be the capacity for that as well. I'm not sure there's any other questions, so we'll move on.
Well, I want to cover 4 points about stewardship this afternoon. Firstly, stewardship is about doing, then have an opportunity for some discussion about stewardship and the planning of stewardship, and then some practical tips, particularly focused on how giving in the church is evolving at the present time. Now, the parable of the talents, this is about doing. And indeed, particularly when we look at the ministry of Jesus, stewardship has a strong focus about doing, or if not about doing, about addressing your lifestyle, as he did to the rich young ruler. But often, as in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, a manager is entrusted with different amounts of money, which he then delegates to servants. So, but it's really using what you have to make a difference or to do something good. So it's about doing and making a difference. And that can occur, as I keep saying, in not just your sort of congregational context, but in a wider context as well. In asking members in a congregation or parish to give, it must be accompanied, I believe, by an articulated vision or goals for the church. It just can't be about survival and really convey the message, give or we're closed. I hope you can see, I'm just holding up a leaflet. Can you see that leaflet? Okay, yeah, which is from our local parish, as I mentioned earlier, about the parish of Castlemaine. And it's the parish's leaflet about the current stewardship focus. And one of the good things about it is that the content is directly related to the parish's mission action plan, which is printed in the brochure. So it's really quite visionary and goal-driven. And I think that's how stewardship has to begin in a congregation. Giving is about inviting members to participate and take responsibility, but not in a way of sort of ordering it. It's got to be a much more participatory and relational engagement. And the emphasis should be on a diversity of things that people can contribute, as I've already said, on funds, time, gift, talents, and we'll explore that in terms of what that could look like as we go through the program. And another practical tip is in terms of discussing stewardship in the parish, don't just have one sermon on one Sunday before the actual stewardship program or union. If you're doing quite a comprehensive stewardship program, and where you really are trying to invite people to make a commitment and even possibly put that commitment on paper and hand it in, or it's taken up in a particular service and dedicated, whatever way you're approaching it, you do have to, I think, plan it. It just can't be, oh, we need to do something about stewardship, and you think, oh, well, the Sunday before I'll preach about it, or we'll give out a leaflet. There does need to be preparation and involvement in terms of how you're going to work with your parish or congregation in relation to it. And it must involve clergy and lay people, obviously. Now, the context change constantly. And from where I look back, say, 40 years ago to where we are today, we need to approach it in a different way. And in fact, even than just, I think, having sermons or teaching about stewardship, we've got to be more participatory. And that means having discussion groups or home meetings where we can talk about what are the factors that influence our giving or our approach to stewardship or our time commitment or talents or giftedness, what else we can offer. So there are varying circumstances that produce different results. And this is tested to by some references in some of the more well-known scriptural stories about giving or people giving or offering, such as the widow was offering in Mark 12 and the anointing of Jesus' feet in Mark 14. These demonstrate different responses in different circumstances. And that's where I think today you do have to do a much more comprehensive exploring of your context and situation as to how you're actually going to go about it. In your parish, church or congregation, have you had a discussion, for example, in the last 5 years about it? If you haven't, you really need to start at scratch, because between 5 years ago and now, we've had COVID. And one of the things that I pick up is I have another little hat that I still wear is called provincial officer for the 5 dioceses in Victoria. And we have at least 3 to 4, in fact, more bishops' meetings a year. And one of the things that I try and track in those bishops' meetings is how's the giving going in parishes during COVID and post-COVID. And all dioceses in Victoria have reported that COVID has had a significant impact on giving. Some parishes are recovering that much more quickly than others. And in some contexts, it looks as though they're going to be quite a while in getting back to where they were. And then there are various other factors. It's not just COVID. It's things like the economy. We only have to be in the current economy and recognise things are pinching. And if you're in a congregation and you've got a significant home debt, loan, well, giving is going to be a real challenge. The role of money and what credit plays in our society is another important variable. Consumerism in Australia is insatiable. I was just hearing in the car driving in here on the ABC that dog ownership in urban areas of Australia, and particularly, as I say, urban areas and our bigger cities, has gone through the roof since COVID. And the income of companies producing pet food has skyrocketed. And the person who was giving this presentation was saying that more money is being spent on our pets than often on our health care or hospital or health insurance. So consumerism and the way it evolves at various times is insatiable. Stewardship in the New Testament is really well worth probing and looking at. As I've said, there are variations of the way stewardship operates. It's not just one pattern of how to do it. We'll come back to that shortly. How do we promote, therefore, stewardship in our parish? What's the context we're speaking to? I remember some years ago in the parish of Swan Hill, where half the congregation I was able to explore before I went were on fixed incomes. In other words, they were largely a congregation which of whom half were pensioners. And I made mention of this in the context of giving a stewardship sermon and said, I expect that there are many people here because of your fixed incomes who would struggle to give perhaps a regular amount. And a person in the congregation said very clearly, so that I ought to be heard, rubbish. And I said to this person, why don't you come out and tell me why you said rubbish? You feel strongly about it. Out she marched. And she said to me, well, even if you're on a pension doesn't mean that you can't give a regular amount and give more, Bishop, than perhaps you think, because I do own my own home. I get all the benefits that go with the pension in terms of subsidies and so forth. I don't have huge tastes and travel widely. So I'm able to give. So in promoting it in your parish, you need to know how your parish is constituted. And you need to have a good idea, if you don't, I'm sure you do, about the state of the parish finances and of the various ways people do give in your parish. So does your parish, for a start, in terms of talking about planning for stewardship, have a clear set of parish goals or mission action plan, however you might define it? What sort of parish do those goals seek to be? Are your goals largely reflecting just maintenance? Are your goals really aspirational? Now, if they are, you need to be, I think, very careful that in setting goals, they are achievable. So you have to have a balance in setting your goals that you're not just going to stay as you are, but you're not going to be so aspirational, they're not going to be delivered. So break the goals down into a set of short-term actions. Often goals like mission action plans were framed in terms of 3 years. I think then they need to be broken down into what are you going to try and do annually and see what that looks like. And you need to keep the congregation really well informed, all congregations really well informed. Have a regular feedback or feature in your pew sheet or whatever you send out, as a lot of parishes do today, an online update of parish news. Really always have something on stewardship. I'm going to have a sip of water. Well, and as part of that, you need to involve as many people in the parish as possible. Don't just leave it to the few. Now, I know that if you mention stewardship in some parishes, people will dive for cover, but you really do need to, at the parish council level or amongst your church wardens, say very clearly to the congregation, we need a planning group of 5. It doesn't have to be bigger. If it becomes too big, you won't agree and you'll spend far too much time meeting and not enough time on doing it. You do need, I think, a nucleus of people who reflect the diversity of your parish or the makeup of your parish and then really start to plan it. And today, as I said, yes, don't just have one sermon, don't necessarily just have a radio leaflet. I would really today want to prepare an audio, visual, online presentation that everybody who, as in my parish, is receiving an online newsletter, make sure you can prepare something that they're going to see online and make sure that it's dynamic, not just a set of slides, a bit like what we're doing here. Have somebody to talk, and not just the rector. Have one of your key lay people talk about. So there's a very practical suggestion. Look, you have to recognise that there's a sensitive issue, and I think today sensitivity is a fairly problematic issue in parishes. Just about whatever you say or do is going to sort of upset something. So you have to realise it is sensitive, and you have to realise how you're going to go about that. And I actually think there's an inverse relationship in the sense that the smaller the parish or the congregation, the bigger the challenge. Because often people in smaller congregations are much more obsessive of their privacy than they are in larger congregations where they're often more willing to be open and share. So that's just a little dynamic that you need to be aware of. Now, tithing, the red herring in some ways of stewardship, is often quoted. And it's very much part of a Hebrew tradition, but studies in large congregations, and I was just showing Archdeacon George a booklet that I've just been looking at, or a book from the United States called Faithful Giving. And it was saying that despite all the rhetoric about the enormous amounts of money that flow into, say, large American congregations, only about 10 to 20% of people are actually tithing in the traditional Old Testament sense of 10% of everything. Well, in some American churches, if people were giving 10%, you would sit down and put your feet up. So I think tithing is a concept worth visiting, but I think in practice, very hard to achieve. Now, we need to be aware of all the trends there are in giving today, and there's a multiplicity of trends. Some people still like to give weekly and like some want to give monthly, some want to give annually. I can remember back in my days in a rural parish, and we were trying to build a new building, and it was in a wheat growing parish. And because wheat growing often has, in terms of farming families, only a giving, an annual giving, because that's where the wheat check comes in, I and one of the church used to go around and collect checks then from the congregation, because that's, and then we'd total it up and say, we're going to meet the budget this year. So it was like that, but that's what they liked. They said, don't come near us. Let the wheat check come in and then come around and talk to us. It's fairly slow because they like to visit. And every time we visited, of course, you could say, well, it's going to be an hour, if not more. So you might only get 3 done in a day. But look, one made the time to do it, and the church warden that came with me on those visits equally committed to it. And I think it took us about 3 weeks to get around and try and do other bits and pieces as well, but that's how it was done. Envelopes were always a regular part of planned giving. They've decreased significantly, I think, and that's partly due to the way in which online giving has been promoted, and a lot of people have signed up to online. But again, anecdotally, I keep hearing that online giving in COVID dropped back a bit. And if they didn't pull out of online giving, they reduced the amount. So online giving is, again, an issue. But again, a way in which I think many parishes have successfully been able to sort of sustain their stewardship. Just this week at the provincial bishops meeting that I went to, we heard about the growth of the online plate. Now, certainly I don't see many examples of that, except that St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne does have an online plate. So when you go to a regular cathedral service in Melbourne now, they hand around quite a significantly redesigned collection plate that gives you the opportunity to swipe an amount through it. Now, it makes the giving process a bit slow, but I can tell you they have long offertory givings to make sure that it does. And they have more people and more plates doing it. But it's very common in England, in visits over the years that I've been to English churches, and I understand it's everywhere in the United States. But one little practical thing emerged this week at the bishops' meeting when one of the dioceses reported that you need to be fairly careful who you go to give you that online platform or the company that's supplying it, because they've run into great difficulty in one parish in their diocese that decided to commit quite significant resources to it, but then found that the actual holder of what was going to be the copyrighter was Chinese-based, and their solicitor that they went to for some advice said, I wouldn't sign it. So they spent quite a bit of time and effort in getting this thing, and they're back to starting from scratch. We've already spoken about online and direct debiting, which is the same thing, really. How much time is spent in your parish on fundraising activities is worth a question. But before we go into the practical tips, we might just check if there are any other questions that have come up. George.
Yeah, I think we've got one I think we'll come back to at the end there on particular study materials congregations could use for discussion and study groups on stewardship. I know there's one book Bishop Andrews mentioned. We'll pop it up on the screen towards the end so you can more easily grab the details, but something for you to keep thinking about there, Bishop. While we see if there are any other questions, I'll throw some thoughts in there. I was at a parish recently. They didn't have the EFTPOS machine built into the plate, but they had it by the front door, the door to the narthex, as it were, as another way of giving. I didn't see anybody actually tapping as they went, but it was there with a little sign, and you could, I think you could nominate the amount, so it wasn't a set figure, but I wondered about that.
Well, I a few years ago now went into a Roman Catholic parish in Melbourne as part of a sort of an ecumenical thing I was involved in. And the first thing I noticed was what was quite a spacious foyer, or narthex we would call it. They had a cash machine. And not only that, they had a quite large, well-produced professional sign up saying, if you would give a commitment to direct debit, they would give you 10% off the primary school fees with the school. So they were offering incentives for you to sign. We didn't quite have the same, but I said to the priest, was this common? He said, pretty common with the parishes that have primary schools.
Yeah, sure, I guess that's.
And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. The other thing that he said by having the cash machine there is that he confessed that he quite often promotes, if you haven't brought cash, you can go out now and get it and bring it back in, so they would have a bit of a break during the Mass to do it. Now, I understand that the use of the machines has declined significantly, and particularly with scamming, they're not nearly it. So parishes that went down that track are probably having to rethink, and certainly I would tend to think they've tried to sign up as many as possible into online. But he was saying to me at the time, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but the more you had in the parish of people who are on just pretty regular weekly salaries or incomes, and if they were sort of in the second half of the giving quartiles, they're not as willing to sign up to online giving as people who have perhaps got significant savings, because they're worried, can they meet all their payments? And so when you get an increase of 25% on electrical charges, we've had in Victoria, people are really on tight budgets.
That leads to another question I've got, Bishop Andrew, your reflections on this. I guess one of the things about in days gone by where you were just putting the money in the plate as it came by, or the envelopes, was that physical act and that reminder of giving. And your thoughts then, when we shift to just online giving and direct giving, it had that benefit that it's done. We don't have to think about it or pat our pockets down and see what loose change we've got. But is there something lost there?
Yeah, I think there is. And in fact, when online giving first came in, a few parishes that I was aware of used to offer a coloured card, a brightly coloured card, that people could still put into the collection plate each week. And often it was dated, so they would still give you, say, instead of a set of envelopes, a set of cards. So they were doing something physically. But the parish was also getting some recognition of, they're there or that's happened. Now, I don't think that lasted. And I'm not aware of it happening now, but certainly I would say a decade ago when online giving was first being promoted. And I remember we even had here in the diocese conversations with the Bendigo Bank of producing a brochure with online giving. And we were trying to sort of get out of the bank, I suppose, that if we got people to move to the Bendigo Bank, would they give us something? They said, we'll give you 1% of something and something. But again, it was very slow. And people, I think, traditionally want to stick to the bank they've traditionally believed. But I think the idea of actually still putting something intangible in is low. The other thing that I think is the impact of online giving is there aren't regular updates of what's actually happening. Because even parish treasurers, I'm not sure, get around to checking the bank statements as regularly as they might, as to see, is it coming in? Some do, I'm sure, but I'm not sure that all of them do.
I guess. I give a little plug for another activity in the Diocese of Bendigo here is moving all our parishes onto Xero, and the bank feed means that you're getting a
Yes,
should be checking it pretty regularly.
Yes, that's right.
Even if you don't know who, the level of
and that is worth saying, because look, there are all sorts of electronic means by which you can make a much more direct linkage between that than what has been the case. And Xero, the accounting package, certainly offers that. And the Diocese of Melbourne are trying to do the same, and they regularly advertise in the diocesan magazine that comes out in Melbourne each month. Have you signed up to Xero?
Yeah.
That's your parish.
We have pretty much all our parishes here in Bendigo on Xero.
Yeah, well, that's the advantage of, I think, again, in a rural parish, you're much more able to try and manage a process like that. And it does have benefits because you can see more clearly how the income's going.
I'm not sure if there's any other questions, so we'll move on, but keep thinking about them, friends, and I'll just...
Well, here are, yes, I'm calling this practical tips. Now, how much time is actually spent in your parish on fundraising? I do get a bit anxious where parishes are spending a lot of time trying to raise money, because I think increasingly there's a trend where the amount of time spent is not really reflected in the actual sum of money that's raised. And I remember visiting a parish in the United Kingdom about 8 years ago, where they were saying that if we can't get out of any fundraising activity at least £2,000, which is 4,000 Australian dollars, it's probably not worth doing when we look at the amount of time and resource that goes into it. Now, I found that quite confronting, because I thought, gee, if I took that back to the Diocese of Bendigo, took it to quite a few smaller congregations, they would shudder and say, wow, that's ridiculous, Bishop. But I think there does have to be some really, creative thinking about fundraising and how we're doing it. The book that I'm going to refer to later, which comes out of the United States, and the big difference is that even Episcopal or Anglican parishes in many parts of the United States can get incorporation or can establish a legal entity so that they can do investing and property ownership in their own right. In nearly all Australian dioceses, that's totally centred in the diocese. Now, so that makes really some of the approaches to giving that you read from overseas, particularly, not easy in our context or our legal arrangements. But certainly in the book I'll refer to later, one of the things that they're suggesting is that don't focus so much on weekly giving. Really work hard on either endowment giving or investment giving, where you're trying to build up a corpus that's going to give you an income. And the thinking behind that is that really cash or online-based giving is not going to keep pace with inflation. And there's plenty of graphs that you can look at to see that, and that the way any parish is going to in the long term survive, particularly if they still have as their goal full-time stipendiary ministry, is they have to think outside the box. So look, that depends really on the nature of your parish. Are you urban, regional or rural? How many members do you have in full-time employment? How many people might you have on fixed incomes? All that sort of information is really important to you to trying to sort of decide what's the strategy you're going to have for stewardship of your parish. The stewardship has traditionally never mentioned actual amounts of giving, but I wonder at times whether the time hasn't come to be more specific about that. I referred to the sermon I gave in the parish of Swan Hill, where the parishioner interrupted me and said rubbish, and I don't know what possessed me, but she was being fairly critical of what I'd said, and I said to her, well, do you want to suggest what you can afford to give, since you're saying you're a pensioner, but you do own your own home? And she said, $25 a week. Well, I was really glad of that. Not sure that quite a few other members of the congregation appreciated her frankness and honesty, but I think it did actually set a bit of a benchmark as to what perhaps they should be considering, because I think that we still do have a lot of sort of what I'd call heritage giving in our parishes, and that is where you just wonder whether the incremental amounts have kept pace with inflation. Now, agreed, again, I keep underlining we have to understand today that, excuse me, people's circumstances do change. I recall where we had a parishioner, an elderly parishioner, who I think was reasonably well off and was giving, because she told me, I'm giving you $120 a week. I thought, gee, that's good. And her health declined and she went into a nursing home where she was a private patient. And in fact, she didn't have any concessional amounts that she could claim. And of course, because she was probably paying $5,000 or $6,000 a week for that, that was the end of her giving. Well, in a small parish, if somebody's giving $120 a week, that was a fairly big chunk. So, but I think at times it doesn't hurt to be a bit specific. You don't have to put it in the first person. I've told that story about Swan Hill and the person who's now since long gone to God. So they're reasonably anonymous, but they do give you a bit more reality and just don't keep it at a conceptual level or even a theological level as to what's happening. And I think in many parishes it does have to come down to a bit more nitty-gritty like that. Now, there are other ways of approaching stewardship, and certainly this is what you'll see in the United States and in even England now, which is traditionally people have thought that, oh, you don't do this, churches don't give much because they get all this money out of the government. Well, they don't give anything out of the government now, but traditionally the Church of England has had historically huge endowments. But now, in the Church of England, just by way of background, they've introduced a deprivation tax. And so parishes in England get directly taxed, what we would call parish share or assessment. And they then tend to work out their parish budget on that. Now, there are some parishes that are that wealthy in England because of inheritance. They don't have to worry about it. But there are other parishes in England which you'll see that the giving is significantly higher than most Australian parishes. So, might we approach stewardship through wills and shares, investment, property, whatever you might call it? And I think there's got to be more thought given to this. I remembered in an Anglican parish in Melbourne some years ago going along to a stewardship event where I was giving a talk at it, but in fact the church warden, who was a professional person, hopped up and gave quite an interesting talk about what he called deferred giving. And deferred giving was about making an appropriation in the will. And not only that, he was saying, and he gave out a little leaflet about it, if you're willing to consider deferred giving, would you be willing to share with the parish that this has happened? So that the parish at least knew that at some point in the future, they might be a beneficiary. That's not common in this, in our culture or context. But I think that it's something that's got to be explored, because there are people in our congregations who probably are sitting on assets, but not much liquid income. Shares are another idea. If they don't want to make a commitment in terms of wills, you could make a commitment in terms of shares. Again, I remember I visited somebody, because one of the things I used to do, even as bishop, was really try and identify people who I thought could give something, perhaps as a legacy to the diocese, because whatever is in the end is given to the diocese is going to end up benefiting congregations or parishes. And I went to see this person because I was told they did have, and they often talked about shares, which was how I was living. So I made an appointment. I went and saw them in their context at their home. I said to this woman, I get the new policy. Oh, she said, yes. I largely inherited from my father, but I built on it. Mm-hmm. And she was very liberal in telling me where she had bought shares. I said, have you ever thought of giving a legacy of some of these shares? And she said to me, as blunt as I'm sitting here, Bishop, you're too late. I said, why? She said, well, the endowment officer of the school that I went to 60 years ago came and visited me with exactly a similar conversation. And because she had never married, and was an Anglican girls' school in Melbourne, she said, I've left them 2/3 of my shares. Oh, I said, I need to be more proactive in trying to find out, or wherever your context is, but I think that's what it's going to come down to, or else we're just going to be sort of like those trees at autumn. We're going to die on the vine. Mm-hmm. And then there is investment, and certainly some parishes do hold investments, even though they're in the name of the diocese, and common things are the parish might own an opportunity shop and therefore be the beneficiary in a sense of having that as an asset. And so at some point it might have to be liquidated, but it gives a parish a bit of an undergirding of their financial position. And if you're able to earn some income out of it, all the better. I was always looking for opportunities to do that as bishop, and certainly I know the Diocese of Bendigo is still proactive in trying to find those opportunities, but a good one is, and I have to tell you, it was a hair-raising process and just about sent the diocesan authorities to like that but in my latter days as bishop, I say latter days, and about 18 months before I retired as bishop, I was approached by an organisation that wanted to build a childcare centre on some parish land. Now, it was complex and difficult to achieve, and I think the diocese and the parish at times were ready to walk away from it. But I can tell you now, I think in time it will be a great resource for that parish. And I drive past it now and think, gee, I'm glad we stuck at that and kept praying about it. And God kept saying, keep going, keep going. And really, it's a great outcome for a small parish in a country town. So there are things that you can do, but it's looking for the opportunity to do them. I remember reading that a reasonable sized parish in a town the size of Bendigo, and Bendigo would be seen as large in our context, but not in the United States, the Anglican or Episcopal parish saw, and one of the parishioners was keen in seeing this, an advertisement in the local paper that McDonald's were looking for a franchisee. And he persuaded a couple of key parishioners to apply for that franchise, which they got, and which in the end they put in the name of the parish. And so the parish to this day is managing a McDonald's family. Obviously, they don't have a lot of hands-on involvement. They have a management, but they are able to say, in our community, we are a significant employer of young people, and we're doing this and we're doing that, and we're a contributor to the Ronald McDonald House where children go. So they are promoting themselves as a parish, and they're involved in the community through that. Now, it's a very ambitious plan they set upon. In that day and age, or when it happened, it only needed a down investment of $300,000, but in the context of a town the size of Bendigo, and that was seen as a huge amount, they did it. But it's just trying to tell you that you need to see, are there any ways we could look at potentially investing in something? Here, you would have to, as I keep saying, involve the diocese. Yes. But there are ways of doing it. Parishes in the past have often gone down the track of aged care or schools. Aged care in quite a few parishes across Victoria has been popular, but it can become a noose around your neck. Because if you sign up often with government funding or social housing funding, the government has really what you call legally a right of possession for up to 35 years. And so you might get it handed back to you when it's going to need a lot of capital. So while you've got a great community use, it's not as an investment going to return you anything. So just be careful of that. Other ways which parishes have really tried to invest is in schools, and that needs really a lot of careful management. It can be said a parish in the diocese of Wangaratta invested in establishing a primary school, which started off with only 16 kids, but it nearly in the end ruined the parish, and they were able to sell it to one of the Anglican schools consortiums, which has really worked well with it. But now the parish in the end didn't get a lot out of it because their investment had been saved by another corporation. But you really need to look around. Similarly with property, is there any property you could do? I had a discussion, you won't mind me saying so, the rector of Castlemaine is looking, Ian and I had a discussion just the other day about the parish of Castlemaine, because there's quite a bit of spare land around. But the parish of Castlemaine sits right on top of a hill called Agitation Hill. And that spare land that it's got is not easy to work with. It's either on a slope or it has no street access. And in fact, I do know, because it's sitting right in the heart of a town, and Castlemaine's a very popular place for developers with housing, retirement. They look at it and say, it's too hard. We're not going to get the return of it. Sorry, Ian. But, yeah, it is hard. So you can have church land that's good. The other thing with church land is that you can easily run into heritage issues, and also today with native title issues you have to be careful with. So even in Victoria, where the Aboriginal population is not very large, what is in Victoria is that the local Aboriginal corporations, which are the succession of the tribe or the nation, Aboriginal nation, have done a lot of work on what they believe is land that they have some claim to. So you need to be careful in developing property. I've often said to parishes that perhaps can do something with property is just buy a shop or something like that. And so, for example, a small rural parish up on the Murray River I encouraged to buy a shop years ago. They promptly stuck an opportunity shop in it, whereas I wanted them to use it as a commercial lease. But it will be there if at the time, some point in the future, volunteers say, and it's well placed. In fact, when we bought it, it was next to the Bendigo Bank, while it was all the more reason I wanted to go as a straight commercial lease. But that's parishes. What else have I got there? Have I got anything else? To engage members, there's no substitute for a visit. And I know that in the old traditional stewardship campaigns, there always used to be associated with a visitation campaign. That's all gone. And visiting people today is because of the busyness of people, and not everybody will be comfortable with you coming into the home. But if you can get a foot in the door, there is no substitute for it. And I think that you can have online programs till the cows come home, you can have sermons and church notices, but often you do have to sit down over the table and just have a chat with people. And the challenge today is to how to do that. I always prefer a visit to a phone call or an email. It's much more time consuming. And even though I'm retired, I still try to keep on visiting a few people, but boy, it's challenging to arrange today. And with COVID, it's even more challenging, although that's relaxed, because I was visiting 2 people regularly in nursing homes, and the procedure you had to go through. So, but there's no substitute for a visit. Well, I've rambled on there, and can see if there are any questions or comments. So I haven't given you a lot of this is how to do it and it's foolproof. But what I've tried to do is cover a range of issues and ideas, but you have to do it. But how you do it will a lot depend upon your confidence. Yeah.
No, I think you've given us a lot of great principles in there, Bishop Andrew, and some practical tips and things for us to be thinking through. As you said, it all depends on our context and how well developed our existing plans are or what we're engaged on.
So I had a small country parish that I had a lot to do with in my latter days as bishop, which is not far out of Bendigo, and I had a lot to do with it because I decided strategically we had to keep presence in this particular town. But when I sat down with the treasurer and said, even if we've got a list of current parishioners, I'm willing to put a couple of afternoons in the doing some visiting. She said no. So, you're starting behind the 8 ball. You don't have some good current data.
Yeah. And in that data, I might throw in an observation. There's having the data of just who comes to church and who's involved in part of the parish, and but to also distinguish that. And I almost recoil against using this term or phrase, and it's certainly not what I think I would use publicly in a service or something, but just to think of, you've got your attendance, but you've also got your giving units. You might have a family of 6, but that's actually only one giving unit, as it were, one family, one source of giving. So to think of that balance.
Yeah, well, I find that particularly in rural congregations, that sort of information is not well defined. No. I went to a parish up on the, again on the Murray River, which was a reasonable size, like it's called a city, and reasonably, I thought, size parish. And again, I said I'd come and do over a period of 3 months 2 stewardship sermons there. And I had a consultation one weeknight before I even went on the 2 Sundays, and I went up, and there was a lot of travelling. And they told me, I said to them, tell me how you see yourselves. And they said to me, we're a retirement community, Bishop, and we're a retirement parish. 2/3 of our members would have been retired. And I said, well, that's possibly well and true, but can you tell me any more data than that? Do you know how many people might own their own home, or do you know, you've got to break it down. And they said, oh, no. There's not much possibility of growth because we're a retirement town. So I came back and went to the ABS figures and looked them up and saw that the biggest single population group in that town were 1835. I was even shocked. And in fact, people over the age of 55 were third. So it was 18 to 35 and then 35 to 55 before you got to the 55 over. And I went back and said that to them and said, you're not a retirement town. The congregation might be a retirement congregation, but you're not a retirement town. And the other thing that you're able to find off the ABS is what's the sort of statistics for the number of people on concessional incomes. And so there are ways of finding what is the level of people who are fully employed. And in fact, much to my surprise, it was a wealthier community than I anticipated. The only trouble is, it seemed to me, the more I looked into it, the majority of wealthy people were of different ethnic and denominational background. But it did show me this was not a poor community. And there was capacity to really... so anyway, I shared that in the first sermon where this woman interjected. And the second time I went down, I had a much more crafted address that applied to this congregation. And in the end, it seemed to be reasonably well received. Nobody came up at the end and said, I'm not shaking your hand, Bishop, I'm not talking to you anymore, but it seemed to be reasonably well received. And in fact, we went back a year later, Jan and I went back a year later, and we even had a fairly old-fashioned traditional stewardship dinner,
Yeah.
no dinner, with a bit of entertainment.
Mm.
It was somebody who sang country and western locally, but look, it was fine. They loved it.
Yeah.
And just serendipitously, some of them got a boot scooting, and I thought, quick, get the electronic
While they're in a good mood.
while they're in a good to take them around. But no, I shouldn't be facetious.
No.
But I think you've got to, in terms of having stewardship, you've really got to know what's the climate of your parish and how's it feeling. If it's positive, you're likely to do better.
Yeah.
And if the parish is full of grumbles, well, I'll show that in the beginning. So, look, you know all those things. They're the things that you have to work with.
I'm not sure there's too many more questions coming in through the chat, friends. We've still got a little bit of time if you come up with them, but I'm wondering, I've got a couple of things to jump back and reflect on. You asked the question, perhaps is it time for us to be more specific in sharing, and maybe it's targets or giving. Wondering your thoughts or reflections on clergy sharing. So the leader, the incumbent in a parish, the priest in the parish, sharing what they give and the challenges or complications there.
I used to feel always, look, if we're not going to talk about specific amounts, I don't think the clergy should, because if the clergy hop up and do it and nobody else was prepared to do it, it's not going to work. And this is a long time ago now, but when I was in a parish, I did approach 5 parishioners to see if they would do it on a Sunday when I would do it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, and I thought I was really sufficiently had a good relationship with these 5 parishioners. And out of the 5, 3 declined. I knew then I was in trouble. On the other hand, in the same parish, we ran a capital fund project to raise $25,000 in one Sunday. It's a bit like an old-fashioned, what they used to call them. There was a anyway, commitment might be a temple Sunday, temple day. And we needed to raise $25,000 in, I felt the best way was, rather than having a long drawn out, to really try and lift the parish's financial position. And I did there, pinching the ideas from fundraising, tried to elicit, could we get 10 parishioners to give $1,000 each? And then I broke it down to 500 and 250, and at the time we had 3 children at school, so I could only give it 250. But surprisingly, people did put their names up to that. It's a bit like a sort of it's a way in which charities tend to use fundraising. But because we were going for a specific amount and breaking it down, they actually got on board. And perhaps at times it needs something like that as a circuit breaker. And that wasn't to in any way detract from their regular giving. It was to try and sort of just lift and give the income to the parish. And I said that if we did achieve it, we would do one major thing in the church or the parish so that they could see the tangible outcome. But I wanted to keep at least half of it just to try and build the parish income. Now that worked. And I thought, I'm going to do this every year. I only was there for 6 years. And so it was one of those ideas you have as the more you get to know the parish. But by gosh, I'd try that again. I did try it in a parish in the diocese, in a place called Donald, if that might mention, where the church was just crumbling. Oh, it was depressing to go with. But it was actually quite a fine brick building. And I was able to get a number of key parishioners there to say, look, from our next we'll check or we check, we'll commit an actual sum. And they did. And so out of that, we were able to do a number of things to the interior of the church, which just gave it a bit more life and vitality. Because I think at times you've got to try and change the culture and the atmosphere of places. And I used to recall as bishops, you'd go into so many of the churches and I thought, oh, this is so depressing. Can't we do something to lift it?
If I think continue on that theme or topic of clergy sharing, and I appreciate you said it does put them in an awkward position if they're the only one, and makes sense.
You can't do it on your own.
No. I've seen examples, I think, too, where rather than individuals, it was, say, the parish council or the wardens gave an indicative sum of what they were giving. It might have been I can't recall if it was for a particular project or just overall as a way of anonymising it a little, but being a bit more specific.
And that was my variation of getting 10 to give $1,000, because they could actually just say anonymous.
Yeah.
But we put up an actual charter, and people could either write their name on it or put anonymous. But it was really a catalyst to try and and so your idea of getting the church wardens collectively, because in a sense it would be anonymous, but it's really just trying to break a seal and create a pattern, or even a challenge.
I think you're right, though. It's breaking that seal, because it's traditionally the topic we don't talk about it.
That's right. Well, the number of times I've had quoted to me, what is it out of Matthew 5? You don't know what the right hand is doing. I've had that quoted to me ad infinitum over the years, and I've largely said, well, look, if I work on that, we'll just go broke. Yeah. So it's a nice scriptural sentiment, but even scripture needs to be understood within the context of the so. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if we have any questions from the group apart from that last one, which we might turn to.
Yeah, we'll take that,
which was on particular study materials or congregation could use for discussion and study groups. This might be a good segue to Andrew.
Yes. Well, look, like most people, when you come to something like stewardship, I did a quick scan of the internet just to see what's actually there. And of course, there's a barrage of material there. Interestingly, I'd have to say not a whole lot from Australia. So that in itself seems something. There's an absolute deluge of material from the United States. But I was taken with this particular booklet because it was on an Episcopal Church website, and the review of the book had been written by an American woman bishop who was the primate of a black Episcopal church, which is a denomination in its own right. But she, just reading a bit about her, she's obviously very well experienced and practiced in leadership and ministry and in theology. And she wrote a review of this book, and so I read the review, and then I read as much as I could on the book online without having to buy it, to be quite frank. And this fellow has written a number of things about stewardship, and when I looked at them, I thought they were quite good, but they are in an American context. But as it says, and I think I've identified this, the reviewer, who's Bishop Christina Rake, says in the first couple of lines, when I first encountered the term plan giving at a very young lay volunteer, I thought it was an oxymoron. Wasn't all giving plan? As I came to discover in ministry, it wasn't. And then I also experienced that faithful giving isn't a repackaging of some tired theory of stewardship, nor is it inaccessibly jingoistic, but it must be something about giving us a sense of future, giving us a sense of reimagining how as an institution, church or congregation we want to be. And I thought that was helpful, because I think that there's got to be a real strong point in stewardship about visioning. But as I say, and make sure the visioning is not just entirely beyond reality and isn't so aspirational. This has changed in this diocese, I'd have to say, in recent times, but I remember going, doing a whip around the diocese after some mission action planning that all parishes were supposed to engage in. And I went to this particular parish, and when it came to under the mission action plan heading of teach, what are you going to do? And they said, open a Sunday school. And this was in a congregation of 12. And I said to them, well, who's going to put up their hands to do it? And they said, oh, we hadn't thought of that, Bishop. Oh, well, I said, we need to think about that, or else we're not going to move anywhere. And that was truly aspirational. And in fact, they couldn't do it. But the Diocese of Bendigo has more recently solved that because they have a program called Sunday School in a Box, which I've only had a very brief introduction to, but I thought, gosh, if we'd been able to be more inventive back then, that would have addressed their goal. Anyway, giving in the United States, as has been asked, is giving in the United States tax deductible? Yes, in principle it is, but you have to say you want to do that. It's not automatic. And indeed, there's a lot of questioning within the United States whether it should continue. The best examples of tax deductibility in terms of church giving are in fact in Europe, in that all the Scandinavian countries have it, as does Germany. And you can there commit to give that through tax deductibility. Now, what they are finding in the Scandinavian countries and Germany is that as church attendance goes down, so is the amount of money that's coming in for it. And so there is always arguments by governments as to whether they want to continue giving tax deductibility. But it's certainly been an absolute undergirding of giving in both the United States and in parts of Europe.
Now, I think I'll switch cameras, but in our Australian context, it's largely limited to building funds or perhaps to education. But the challenges around the restrictions and having to...
Yes, you had to, under the Tax Act, have a building that was going to be a war memorial. It was initially. Now, I think that's actually gone. It was very much in its heyday after World War II, very popular with churches to build halls. And in fact, in the baby Burma period, a lot of church buildings were helped enormously through tax deductibility. Today, with churches, it's largely limited to the charitable area of if you're sort of doing something in the community that's incorporated, you will be able to, with filling out all the forms and legal documents, get some tax deductibility. And with educational or school initiatives. But it needs to be underlined that the taxation office is being more scrupulous than ever in saying who they'll give it to.
The restrictions that can come with it are sometimes more onerous and binding than just saying just give directly to the church.
They are. And I know the diocese here has explored it, as has most dioceses. Quite a few dioceses have established foundations with tax deductibility. But the problem has come that they can't fulfil the obligations of the foundation that they've got to do to be able to do it. There was another one that was popular, particularly in parishes in Melbourne for some years, which had to do with the resettlement of refugees. You could get some of that. But again, it was quite onerous because you had to make a commitment to initially find housing and employment, and all sorts of conditions were placed upon it and how you could spend the money.
Now, just as we continue to draw to a close, Bishop Andrew, I know you've got some questions here for, I think, for people to continue take away. Do you want to just step us through these?
But Archdeacon George, did you have another resource?
We had some other resources which we might put out on email. That came through recently. I don't recall them offhand.
Well, these are some questions that I had, and if we're in a sort of a study group or some sort of consultation, I would be wanting you to if not answer on the day, take away and come back with them. They come back to them. Does your parish have a current stewardship program? I should have worded that better, because if it does, I want to know what it is. What's the nature of it? So I don't want you just to say yes or no, and I should have worded the question better. The second question is, what is your understanding and experience of stewardship? So it's really helpful to know, what does the current congregation or church members understand of it, and what is their experience of it? Because particularly in congregations that have quite a few people over the age of 60 and more so over 70, they'll all go back to the planned giving programs of the 1970s, which were very time-consuming, and they used to record the giving.
Yeah.
And if you got behind in your giving, you'd get this letter from the parish saying, you've missed your giving, which a lot of people then got their noses out of joint with. So it's important to bring out what are the positives and what are the negatives, and to know what's their experience. Does your parish have a regular financial update? And by a regular financial update, please don't just put in the parish pew sheet or whatever other communication you have that we need $1,500 a week and only $1,200 coming in. That's not helping people at all. And if you have a variety of funding activities or activities to raise funds, you need to regularly say, what has those funds brought in towards the budget this year? Just don't say, oh, we raised $400 from this, because people have no idea then what's that actually contributing to the parish, because then people go to the annual meeting, which is the only time really the figures are seriously looked at, and see, hang on, the parish is heading for a $5,000 deficit.
Yep.
What happened to the fundraising? I thought that was to cover it. Well, it didn't raise that much, and the parish is still looking at a $5,000 deficit. So you need to give your parish not pages, but you really do need to give them a much more fulsome. And indeed, I would be saying the treasurer should give a quarterly update on how the parish is travelling, and put that up if you've got the capacity for an overhead screen in the church. Put it up and let people see it. I've always been a person that loves graphs and figures. And if you watch the ABC News in Victoria, might be similar in other states, the ABC News at 7 o'clock in Victoria, 4 nights a week we get an update on the state of the finances of, be it our state, the stock market. It's fairly encompassing in just 2 minutes, by a man called Alan Kohler. And his graphs are brilliant. I see more in 2 minutes with his graphs than I'd see in reading all of the finance pages. So you've got to be really imaginative and creative in giving that update.
I've seen some simple, just pie graphs that break down, just in the broadest categories. Here are our sources of income, and you can very easily see then how much came in through the plate versus the op shop, and how much was other donations, and a corresponding one for expenses, and people can see how they match up, and here's where the money's going to. And then I guess you need the comparison between the difference between those.
Absolutely. I had an involvement with a university college for many years, and so I still get their annual report. And I had a look at the annual report the other day, because it's just come being that they work on financial year. They had some interesting pie graphs in the back, but even more so, they had a comparison over the past 3 years, because if you look at the graph with what happened in 2021 with COVID, things weren't so crash hot because there were no students in college. But if you look at it now, there were some clear signs of recovery. And I was just interested to see with the pie, where are they getting the funding from? You need to have a clear set of your parish's current goals. I think mission action plans are good, but one of the learnings I would say from mission action plans is that parishes put too much in them. I came to the view, as I sort of really finished as bishop, parishes and we used to in this diocese, and traditionally mission action plans have worked on a quartile, that there shouldn't be more than 2 goals in each box. And parishes will put down 6 or 7 I'd look at them and think, there's no way they'll achieve this, and then they'll be sort of disappointed at the end of it. You must curb disappointment in parish life. Parish people want to feel we've achieved something. So I would have current goals. If you don't have a mission action plan, whatever way you do it, but have it that it's, I think, going to be good to achieve.
Yeah.
And what do you see as the way forward where you are? If you're struggling, and look, many parishes are struggling, I keep quite an analysis of wearing my hat as provincial officer in Victoria from a range of material I glean, how a parish is travelling across the diocese, across the province of Victoria. And I can tell you now that in Victoria, there are less than 1,000 parishes. In fact, it's less than 500. In fact, it's now less than 400. And of around those 400 parishes, about a third are struggling. And even in an urban setting like Melbourne, Melbourne has roughly 200 parishes. There is clearly a third involved that are struggling. But that's the same without getting too particular around it. So what do you do? And so you've got to be, I think, again, thinking, how do we see a way forward and what's the way forward? Certainly within England, and I've said this, and this was one of the catalysts to starting the sort of ministry training program that I envisaged here, which they now call the Curnow Centre, thankfully, thank you. But one of the things that I was really motivated by is that I read in 2012, when I went to a training thing in England, that a third of the parishes in England were now non-stop. Oh, that blew me off my seat, because I just thought they all were paid in England, but they weren't. And the Church of England has now made some very intentional decisions that they are working towards 40% of parishes in England being only part-time. So they're really saying the idea of trying to keep all these parishes the same. So what we've got to do is stop closing parishes, because that doesn't help our PR or the way people feel about us. And it doesn't, I agree. There was a parishioner died in a parish just in this diocese in the past week, only a small country town. And she gave me the rounds of the kitchen table a number of times, and the current rector sent me an email to say she'll actually die, and probably said at her last gasp, "Oh, that bishop, I'm breathing." But look, she was at least, despite us having some vigorous discussions around her kitchen table, willing to acknowledge her parish was not sustainable for full-time mission, because they'd set all their heart and soul on raising every cent they could on that. And what we don't do very well, I think, across Australia as diocese parishes is, as I've mentioned so often today, is intentional planning. And instead of saying to parishes, oh, you'll have to close, really start dealing with how are we going to deal with it. Well, the initiative of the Curnow Centre and the Australis program was to deal with that very issue. And it's music to my ears, I'm stating, that at the Victorian Bishops' meeting this week, at least 2 other dioceses in Victoria are now beginning to realise perhaps we should start doing that. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you gleaned something from this, and I pray for you all.
Thank you. No, well, thank you, Bishop Andrew. Thank you for your time, for that wealth and depth of reflection, and for guidance to us all. Thank you, everybody who's joined us from around Australia. As I said, the recording will be made available shortly for you to share with others, and we pray it's a blessing for them. This is, I think, the last of our Australia-wide workshops for this year. We have one more coming up later in the year, which is on Advent and Christmas resource sharing, primarily for the Diocese of Bendigo. But if you're from outside of Bendigo and you'd like to be part of it, please drop us an email and we'll happily invite you to come and be part of it. And we're looking to what workshops we run next year. So welcome your suggestions, ways that we can serve you and can be a blessing to those engaged in rural and remote and regional ministry around Australia, and even for those of you who are stuck in metropolitan areas, we'll even come and help serve you as well. Yes. Thank you very much, Bishop Andrew. Thanks to Zan, who's been managing the technology for us all. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. We'll say a short prayer and then release everyone to get on with their day. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for everything that you have blessed us with and entrusted into our care. We thank you for not just gifts of money and those who've given generously in the past, in the present, and who will give in the future to support the work of the church, but of all the different ways that people give through their time and through their gifts of talents and energy. We pray for those who are in leadership that you'll help us to guide discussions on stewardship, to plan for it, and to see that it's about doing, and to not just doing for doing's sake, but doing for the building up of your kingdom, for proclaiming the good news of your Son. We thank you for Bishop Andrew and his time with us this afternoon, and for all those who've been able to join me. And pray you'll bless us as we go forth from here now, for your name and for your sake. Amen. Thank you, everyone. God bless and goodbye.